I want to play this sound because we're going to get into some of the ideology of Breitbartism. Uh, the part of the ideology that is, in fact, very effective and smart in this particular global moment, and it is a global moment. The National Front is leading campaign opinion polls in France. We already have neo-fascist governments in Hungary. Uh, Brexit, obviously, was a project of the UK far right. Mark Blyth, who's been on this show before, at a November 9th forum at Brown's Watson Institute for International Affairs, talks about this global Trumpism. And what he's identifying here is the economic aspect of the story. There's no contradiction. It's about xenophobia. It's about racism. It's about misogyny. But when you have the fusion of the global failure of center-left parties, neoliberalism, that people's living standards have not raised, that we have global massive inequality, it opens the door for the wolves. And I saw it coming. I just didn't think it was coming this quickly. I apologize for that. Mark Blyth did. Let's take a look at his assessment of the election.
About it. From 1945 until 1975, we targeted a particular economic variable called full employment. And there's a thing called the Lucas critique, which basically says if you keep targeting something, people will game it. And they did. Unions gamed it, employers gamed it, and the result was inflation. And after a while, that inflation became painful enough for the people who were hurt by it, who were the creditor classes in these countries, to band together and fund a market-friendly revolution. And they liberated finance, and they deregulated banks, and they integrated the economies of the world. And they globalized labor such that labor could no longer demand that it gets its share of productivity, because if you don't, I'll just move your job somewhere else. And all of those trade agreements that were signed, the globalization, which is inevitable and we can't roll back. You know, you can go on the web and type in WTO text, and you'll find that it's a very long 700-page legal agreement that took 5 years to thrash out between corporate interests, lawyers, lobbyists, with very little input from civil society. The same is true of the EU's agreements on capital movements, the banking union, take your pick. And there's a moment when people just began to figure out that for the past 30 years, going from 1985 until now, huge amounts of money have been generated in the global economy, and as we know from the work of Thomas Piketty and others, most of it's gone up to a tiny fraction of the population. So there's been a huge amount of growth, but hardly anyone's benefited. You don't have to go far to see this. Get off the east side. Go to the west side of Providence. Go to northwest Providence and walk into neighbourhoods which have check cashing agencies, fried chicken joints, pawn shops, broken down fix your mobile and networks you've never heard of stores. That's the reality for people, not just here, in many, many countries. So they're a bit fed up with this. And they've decided at any possible opportunity, whether it's Brexit, the Italian constitutional referendum or anything, to basically give their elites notice that we've had enough of this. And that's what this is. Now, there's a macroeconomic underpinning to this one too, because after we decided to target on full employment for 30 years, we decided to target inflation for 30 years. I don't see why the Lucas critique doesn't actually apply to that one as well. And we've managed to create a world in which you can dump 13 trillion euros into the global money supply through quantitative easing and other programs, and there's no inflation anywhere. And here's your problem. When you've levered up your banking system and bailed it out, dumped it on the public purse and said you need to cut that terrible debt, when people's personal balance sheets are still bloated from all the credit they took on in the 2000s, and they don't have wage growth and there's no inflation to ease the burden of the debt, then the creditors fight harder to get their money back. Whether it's the case of Germany versus the rest of the Eurozone, whether it's the form of the creditor class versus the debtor class, what we have everywhere are creditor-debtor standoffs. And those creditor-debtor standoffs take different forms. For the left, it takes the form of Podemos. For the right, it takes the form of the National Front. And for Trump, which has a weird coalition, which is of course sexist, and of course racist, and of course anti-immigrant, and all the rest of it. But one part of it is, if you look at the states that really fell hard, the Rust Belt, it's economic.
That's true. And this is the global threat right now. If there is not a serious left response that deals with an economic system that has been designed and rigged to support an incredibly small percentage of the population, that has created unprecedented medieval levels of inequality, it will open the door to things that are already alive in the system. This is why it's not a debate. I really reject categorically the notion that there is a conflict between recognizing, in the United States as an example, that, yeah, racism, white supremacy is in the DNA of this country. This country was created on genocide, built on slavery, and administered through apartheid, which only legally ended in the 1960s. And has all sorts of different, I mean, if you go to the West Coast, you can see specific histories of racism towards, Chinese immigrants, not to mention Hispanic. I mean, this is a profoundly racist country. It's also a country where there was a misalignment in the Democratic Party, and Matt Stoller identified this beautifully in a great piece in The Atlantic, came out about a week before the election, where you basically had a tendency where the split between the needed project of social liberation and economics and reining in corporate cartels and monopolies were completely split. I would add in the 1990s, they weren't actually entirely split because Bill Clinton and the Clinton administration were actually quite willing to play footsie with racial demagoguery. So that's the landscape we're in. And the argument inside the Democratic Party that somehow was created between people that were super woke and supposedly all of these bros that didn't care about gender and race, it must end, because the only way to do this is to synthesize and synchronize and move on those things simultaneously. It's impossible to do otherwise. And the threat is very clear, and it is a global moment, which third way neoliberal nonsense is entirely unequipped for. And neoliberal had its reign. It looks like now we're having a reign of at least a form of really bluntly neo-fascism.
Hey, it's Sam Seder. Why don't you subscribe to this channel? You can do so right over here. Over. Subscribe.